Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
How
not
heroic
fucking
he
idiot.
comes
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Well, okay. Welcome to another episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the hopefully rational left. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me today is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, I want you in some ways, I want to ask you a few questions about your background to fill out your bio, because I could do some PhD, blah, 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 but I'm more interested in somewhat hearing the story as a way to talk about how you got interested in politics and leftist politics in particular, and as a way of kind of opening up your perspective on things, which saw you originally, I think, on a platypus panel, and then on a few different things. And I really, my first interest was okay, I'm a sucker in some ways for heterodoxy. And so I hate orthodoxy. So that's why I do like platypus and other somewhat more unorthodox views, depending on, they might be orthodox depending on how you see Marxism or something. But I just enjoyed the kind of different approach that you tend to take. There's obviously a fealty that I feel with it, but I'm interested in hearing a kind of different perspective. And so that's where I kind of was turned on to you and the stuff you've written for sublation and other things. I always found it interesting. So welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So a bit of biography, in some ways, can you go through a bit of where you're from, and kind of, last I heard or last I've seen, you were in across the pond, as it were. Are you still over there? Are you staying over there? What's that? So how did you get over there and to your PhD? Take us through the brief life story of Ben Studebaker.
So I grew up in Indiana. My father was editor-in-chief of Control Magazine, a magazine that focuses on process automation, and my mother is a psychotherapist. So professional class family.
Sure.
I went to a public high school in Indiana. I was very bored in high school because I just wanted to do politics and history and social studies, and they kept making me do other things. And I got really annoyed with the whole thing. So I started going, where can I go for uni where they won't make me do these other things that I don't want to do? And I discovered that in Britain, there are no gen ed requirements, and they don't really care about your grade point average. They just focus on test scores, and I know how to pass tests. So I went over for undergrad at the University of Warwick. I finished that. I came back. I did a master's at University of Chicago. And then I hopped back over and did the PhD at Cambridge. I finished that PhD up right as COVID was hitting. So I then came back to the States when COVID hit, and I haven't actually left the States since then.
Okay.
I've been back in the States, and I've been working on a variety of different writing projects. My dad died of cancer after I got back. And so that was a reason to stick around and kind of hang around a little bit, help my mom out.
Sure. Well, obviously, sympathies and whatnot, that's no fun for sure. But yeah, you're being the dutiful son, so that's good. So that being bored in high school and being interested in politics tracks very much with me. was it really just like the school and the grade point average that made you interested in England, or were you a bit of an Anglophile? Was there other reasons to go to England rather than somewhere else in Europe or somewhere else? Is it something particular? Is it just English language? What made you want to do England?
Well, the foreign language education at my high school was not very good.
Right.
I
Yeah.
took French the whole time I was there, but I think I knew less French by the end of high school than I knew when I started.
I was able
So-
to do band as my, music as my second language. So I didn't even have to take French or anything.
Yeah, they offered people that option. You could do music instead of a foreign language. I did take the foreign language, but I didn't get very much out of it. So I didn't feel very comfortable operating in a country where they weren't going to speak English. I mean, it was difficult for a lot of people where I grew up to even imagine going out of state for college,
Sure.
let alone going to another country. So I wanted to be somewhere where at least I would be able to understand what everybody was saying.
Do you have any plans to go back, or are you in the States? I mean, you've got the PhD now, right? You've defended and everything. You are now doctor. So are you staying in the States? Do you have any interest in going back?
I don't know. I'm open to the possibility of staying in the States, and I'm open to the possibility of going back out over there. I'd consider maybe some other stuff in other places at this point. I think I'm old enough and experienced enough that I might try something more experimental. But yeah, I'm thinking about going back there, but also thinking about staying here.
So, the normal track for someone with a PhD is to try to get a job teaching at a university somewhere. Is that your goal, or do you have something else in mind?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do an academic job if it's the right job in the right place, teaching the right kind of stuff. I'm not somebody who's going to, adopt a bunch of positions I don't believe in to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
I will make the kind of stuff I make, and hopefully people like it. And if they do like it and they want me to teach, I'm very happy to do that.
Right on. Okay. As I'm curious, because I've seen you take what I would consider to be at least not sometimes predictable positions on things, and as lame as it is in some ways to ask, where do you see yourself kind of politically? Obviously, you've got a political. Is it a political science? What is the actual PhD you're in? Is it a political economy? What is it?
At Cambridge, it's called Politics and International Studies.
Okay, gotcha. Where do you, and maybe even on international issues, do you have a realist perspective? Is in some of the jargon of the political science nerddom, where do you place yourself on? It's not necessarily a spectrum, but in the whatever it is, the tangled web of political views and positions.
Yeah, I guess the short story of how I got to where I am, I started getting into politics when I was 8 during the 2000 Gore-Bush election. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I got really fascinated by that and the whole fight over Social Security lockbox and strange things to be interested in as an 8-year-old.
Sure.
But for whatever reason, it got me. So I was behind Gore at the time, and I got very upset with Bush about the Iraq War, about the response to 9/11, about the creation of the TSA. So initially, a lot of my politics as a kid was about opposing the Iraq War and opposing the Bush administration. I then got very upset when Bush was reelected when I was 12. This really upset me, and it caused me to fundamentally lose confidence in the American political system. If it's a system that can reelect Bush, then it has serious, serious problems that people are not grappling with. Then 2008 happened. So that turned me from focusing on foreign policy and Middle East stuff to more the economy, more issues of class, issues of rising economic inequality. Toward the end of high school, I actually started reading political theory, which they never assigned, and I just kind of assumed, well, if they're not assigning it, it must be because we're not yet ready to read it.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, it was the year before my senior year, I want to go to college. Maybe these Europeans, maybe they will have read stuff, and I won't have read stuff, and I'll be disadvantaged. I should read something. So I read Plato, I read Hobbes, and I read Marx as my kind of beginning.
Okay.
Why did I pick those three? Because when I Googled around, they seemed important.
Sure.
Right?
Right. Republic, Leviathan, and Capital. Or I mean.
Yeah,
Sure.
Capital and the Manifesto. Part of Capital, part of the Manifesto. I wasn't totally sure which combination of things to read at that point.
Sure.
And, like anybody, when you start reading theory, you think they all agree with you. So you just notice how they fit together, and you don't pay attention to the major differences.
Sure.
But, at least you're getting into it. So by the time I came to undergrad, I had a left perspective, but it was an autodidact left perspective that was really based on my own reading, my own paying attention, which I'd been doing for a very long time. So my advantage versus my peers is I'd been following since the year 2000. My disadvantage is that I had really no formal anything at that stage. So over the course of the first half of the tens, I had this position that was molded by very much Bush getting reelected in 2004, focused on democracy as a system which cannot produce justice and which cannot produce either a good foreign policy or a good economic policy. Around 2016, Bernie Sanders was outperforming what I expected him to do. I thought, okay, Bernie Sanders might get 10% in a Democratic primary, and that would be about it. He did a lot better than that. And that made me go, okay, well, my priors would not have predicted that. So maybe there's more potential in the democratic system than I've been assuming. So, and when I was over at Cambridge, my supervisor there was David Runciman. And David Runciman has this book called The Confidence Trap. And in The Confidence Trap, he argues that at this point, it's very difficult for us to imagine some other political system being better than democracy. Democracy has survived so many things, and it's seen off so many alternative political systems. It's very difficult for us to even envision there being another system that we would want, let alone actually bringing such a thing about. And it had this effect on me, and I went, I've been, since I was 12, thinking this system is bad and doesn't work, and it's therefore eventually it has to go. But just as Bush didn't have to go, the system doesn't have to go. Just because it doesn't work doesn't mean people will get rid of it. And so I started to go, well, if democracy is what we've got, and Bernie Sanders performed better than expected, maybe I should be really behind that. Maybe I should be putting my energy there. So I did that for a while. I even got into podcasting related to the 2020 campaign. I really threw myself at it. But it didn't work. And throughout the process of it not working, there were lots and lots of things to learn. So what I kind of came out of that with is, again, a kind of renewed position of being critical of the whole thing, but with a certain wisdom that comes from also integrating David's point about just the fact that it doesn't work doesn't mean it will go away. And at this point, my work is characterized by what I would call the kind of realist part, which is that this system is incredibly tanky and durable and very hard to get rid of. And there are all sorts of reasons why, and we can get into why. And the other, which is that this system is an incredibly fell thing. We have a slave class of workers who are denied not just, say, a fair wage for their time, but even the very possibility of pursuing truth, the good philosophical concepts. They don't get the kind of education that they would need to do these things. They're told over and over that such education is useless. They are denied the possibility of a full human life. So this is a system which creates incomplete, miserable people who then grasp after completeness through all sorts of different lifestyle mistakes. They take jobs they shouldn't take. They marry people they shouldn't marry. They do all kinds of things to try to cope with the fact that they're stuck doing jobs all the time that are unfulfilling, that can never be fulfilling, and will never lead anywhere fulfilling. And so I try to keep both of these things in my mind at the same time when I do theory. It's, on the one hand, this thing is really, really tanky and way more durable than you think. And as soon as you start to think that there's a way out, now you're really getting tricked. And every time I've started to go, well, maybe it's been peanuts. It's that the comic strip of Charlie Brown and the football where Lucy pulls the football away from Charlie Brown. As soon as you start to think you're getting out of this thing, well, very, very likely you're wrong. At the same time, it's horrible. This is a really horrible system. It's relentlessly bad.
So there is that you're not in some ways like convinced or take the position that I think a lot of people who call themselves Marxists would take, which is that there's a kind of inevitability in the impermanence of this system, primarily because of the fact that it engenders all of this kind of either like mass misery when it comes to war or just deep alienation and this inability to kind of live complete flourishing lives. And the idea there is that if you have a system that is it is both unstable and produces this widespread alienation, that it just can't endure forever, and that it will somehow inevitably come to pass. And then, of course, you adopt that historical perspective and say, well, yeah, look, I mean, we've seen that kind of thing happen before. And so is there, in your view, is there something particularly durable about sort of modern bourgeois democracy or kind of liberal democracy, as they would call it, that is unique as compared to other systems? I mean, when you do look at something like the Roman Empire, people don't totally grasp the fact that you're talking about like 1,000 years and more, right, of like a culture. Now they had different political systems even within the sort of Roman Empire, but as a kind of political unit, it's a long time. It must. I mean, in the first century, obviously, it seemed like it was never going to end, but then it eventually did. Is this system? Are we in that kind of first or second century of the Roman Empire period where we have a system that seems very durable, but that we would likely be very surprised by its actual fragility? I mean, do you think that this system really is as strong as it appears, or is it a kind of edifice on a otherwise crumbling infrastructure?
Yeah. So when I do Roman Empire comparisons, the century of Roman history that I think is the best for comparison's sake is the 4th century, the 300s.
Okay.
Right?
The crisis period, the crisis of the...
The crisis is the 3rd century. The 4th century is the period where things are fabulously wealthy. They get fabulously wealthy again. So they have this revival. But in the Western Empire, that's the century before the collapse century. And in the Eastern Empire, there's another 1,000 years after that century.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So in this century, people think, when they just think about Roman history, if they don't know it, they think, well, as soon as Julius Caesar gets in and it becomes an empire, then you have, Caligula and Nero and it collapses. But it doesn't.
Yeah.
And if they know about, the crisis of the 3rd century, and they know about, Aurelian, the Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, they go, well, that was the century where things came off the rails. But it wasn't. At this point, the historiography suggests that the 4th century was very nearly as rich as the 2nd century, previously considered to be the exclusive peak. Right? The century with Constantine is a fabulously rich century, and it's completely marked by religious turmoil and conflict and enormous disagreements about all sorts of fundamentals, but it's the richest century and it's one of the most stable centuries politically, right? Then you get the 5th century, and the Western Empire collapses in the 5th century, but for reasons that are really, really contingent. If you go into exactly why, the reason why is that there's a set of Vandals that cross into Gaul. A Roman general pins these Vandals down and is about to have them destroyed when he gets distracted by a civil war that happens to take place at the same time. He goes to deal with the civil war. The Vandals then cross into Spain. The Romans again pin the Vandals down in Spain and are about to deal with them. And the Vandals, to avoid being destroyed, flee to Africa.
Yeah.
Once they get into Africa, the Romans fail to contain them, and they capture Carthage, which breaks the trade backbone between North Africa and Italy, and breaks, therefore, the capacity to support all shipping throughout the Western Mediterranean, because all shipping throughout the Western Mediterranean was based on a subsidized grain transport system that ran from North Africa to Italy. So it damages the whole Western economy once they get to Carthage. And then, of course, people hear about the sack by the Vandals of Rome or the sack by the Goths of Rome. But ultimately, the thing that cripples it is that they lose Africa, the second most important part of the Western Empire, to these Vandals. And they lose it to the Vandals because they succeeded in containing the Vandals in Gaul enough that the Vandals felt they had to flee to Spain. And they succeeded in containing the Vandals in Spain enough that the Vandals felt they had to flee to Africa. And then only then, because they were unable to deal with it at that juncture, does it become critical. So you need so many little happy accidents to happen. And so when people go, why did the Roman Empire collapse? They love to give these grand narratives about its inevitability. They sound almost like a certain kind of Marxist theorist of history going, well, there was decadence and there was corruption and there was pestilence. No, they lost because they almost won twice against those Vandals. And if they'd beaten the Vandals, then they could have hung around as long as the Eastern Empire did. The Eastern Empire almost reconstructed the Western Empire. It sent an expeditionary force, it captured Carthage, it sent that force into Italy, it reconstructed that network. It's just it was then constantly distracted by affairs in the East and was unable to consolidate those gains. So I think when we talk about inevitabilities, really tanky systems like the American Empire and the Roman Empire are very, very hard to get rid of. They will not just be killed by their internal contradictions. They need exogenous external events that are very difficult to predict to catalyze and exploit the existing internal divisions. So that, the Civil War that causes the Roman general not to finish the Vandals off in Gaul, that is a function of the Roman political system. But the Roman political system generated loads and loads and loads of civil wars, most of which had no real consequences at all for its longevity. It's just that particular one at that moment, given what was going on with the Vandals. So you need this external element in there to begin with, and the war at that time with that general involved in just that way.
See, now to me, I hear this with the several years of being like neck deep in Trotskyist views and things of saying that, there is this trend in even wider Marxism of the sort of rejection of the traditional orthodox Marxist notion that the ultimate sort of socialist revolution is going to happen in the most advanced capitalist economies, because that will be where the working class is the most advanced and able to actually recognize itself as a class, then gain its revolutionary potential, actually engage in the revolution, and be able to actually exist in whatever new formulation it is that they ultimately end up with. And then, of course, that's the criticism that Russia was never in that position. It couldn't hold on. It was merely going to be the kind of vanguard revolution for revolution to spread. That didn't happen. And so then you have this, sort of theory of permanent revolution, both in terms of continuing revolution in places where you have not already had a capitalist revolution, but the kind of notion of the combined and unequal development having this potentially catalytic aspect of periphery revolutions needing to go through this permanent revolution where you kind of continuously get to, revolutionizing society constantly until you can kind of skip over the long development of capitalist, the capitalist epoch in a certain place. But that if there is these kind of disruptions in the periphery, then that will be the sort of Vandals taking Carthage moment where it would be so disruptive to the centers, the sort of capitalist centers, that it will itself kind of be a catalyst for revolution there. I'm curious what, in some ways, like what you think of that analysis as a kind of, dare I say, reformation of a sort of another maybe potentially heterodox position within wider Marxism. Of course, the Trotskyists would say it's perfectly in line because you have to be, I guess. I'm not that interested in being so kowtowed to traditional Marxist views that I don't really care. But it does seem to me that if I'm hearing you correctly, in that likely the sort of strength or rigidity of the system that we exist in now is likely not going to internally be disrupted to the degree that it would collapse or significantly change, but it likely will be something from outside. Do you find there to be, I think, value in that Trotskyist position of the combined and unequal development and its potential revolutionary reverberations in the world?
Yeah, so One thing that has really changed that makes it hard to make the old argument that the revolution has to kick off in the rich state is that the factories aren't in the rich state. And when they are in the rich states, they are run by increasingly machines. So the general strike in the rich state isn't possible because the worker in the rich state can no longer shut down the factory. Now, in the poorer countries, the worker might be able to shut down the factory in one country, but there are lots of other countries that the factories can move to if that particular country is no longer a good place to have a factory. Because of this, a left revolution is associated with capital flight. And that makes it very difficult for left-wing people in developing countries to make the case that going in a left-wing direction will help solve problems. Possibility of capital flight means that as soon as it happens, all that money is going to drain away. And not only will all the money drain away, but then oftentimes, the United States will undertake foreign policy measures to collapse the government or to collapse whatever kind of radical movement is getting going. In the Cold War, we worried a lot about domino theory, in IR. There was a lot of this kind of domino theory stuff about, well, if communism happens in one developing country, it will then spread all over the place. We make fun of the Americans for having had that position with respect to Vietnam because it's very clear that that's not how it worked and not how it would work. It's an interesting case where some trots and some like hardcore Cold War American IR people have the same view in thinking that if a small developing country becomes left-wing, that this will be the end of everything. In practice, what we tend to find is that the capital just runs away from these countries unless they have oil. If they have oil, then they have something to bargain with. And then in cases where there's oil scarcity, they'll be treated more gently. So it's possible to have a petrol left state when oil prices are high. But that state will then have instability when oil prices come down.
A la Venezuela.
Like Venezuela, right? Or like Libya, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's possible to have a kind of left-wing petrol state, but that state's going to operate out at the periphery of things. It won't be able to get any capital to develop its economy internally apart from the money it's able to raise by selling oil, right? So then if you want to move away from oil in response to climate change, and that's what we're doing, those states are going to have less leverage and those governments aren't going to be able to work anymore. So we're going to, by moving away from oil, make it impossible to do the left petrol state. There's you could talk about big pan-Arab, pan-African movements that are attempting to very quickly get lots and lots of states. When that happens, the United States quickly militarily overwhelms those movements. I'm not trying to suggest that the Islamic State is a left-wing movement. I don't think that it is, but it's an example of a kind of pan-regional movement that tries to get going very fast, accumulating lots of territory. It was not possible for that movement to compete with the United States military. Some people fall back on an argument to do with China here. They'll say, well, what about China? The issue, of course, is that China depends very heavily on Western importers because it has this export-driven economy, and it is not easily able, due to its internal politics, to transition into an economy that's led by its own internal consumer market. So if there is disruption to that trade relationship, it will have much more severe consequences for China than it will for the United States.
Do you think, though, China has obviously taken lots of efforts to move away from that export-dominated sort of economy to create an internal, consumer economy, and do you think that that's insufficient to protect them against kind of potential disruption? To me, it seems like although they are very much in some ways dependent on outside consumption of what they produce, they are rapidly becoming, a much more consumer. They're consuming their own internally made stuff, and so it seems like maybe at right now that does seem like more of a danger, but that it could not be as big of an issue 10 or 15 years. Do you think that's possible? Or do you think that that's not going to happen?
A good person to read on this is Michael Pettis. He makes this very interesting argument that there is entrenched elites in China at this point that benefit from certain discongruities with the Chinese economic system. If you get into some of this stuff about the property market in China and the tendency in China to build enormous amounts of stuff that nobody lives in or buys, the economy in China is organized in such a way that the consumer, the ordinary Chinese worker, never gets a very large slice of things. Instead, when the pie gets bigger, it goes to these particular organs of the Chinese state in the economy, and these organs are blowing the money on buildings that are unnecessary and infrastructure that's unnecessary. Here in the United States, we can't get infrastructure built that we desperately need. And in China, there is extra infrastructure, superfluous infrastructure that nobody needs. Here, we have people buying all sorts of little luxury goods that at prices that are very, very low, luxury goods that are trivial compared to their real needs: healthcare, buildings, housing. In China, there is plenty of housing, but people have a very hard time buying those little kinds of luxuries and consumer goods. This imbalance between the United States and China causes enormous grief for both Americans and the Chinese. But in the Chinese political system, there are just as many obstacles, if not more obstacles, to changing this situation as in the American political system. And I think for some people in the Western left looking at this, they don't necessarily understand how the Chinese political system works, in part because it's very hard for outsiders to understand how the Chinese political system works.
Right.
And so there's an assumption that, well, it's like an authoritarian thing, and Xi Jinping can just make things occur in the system. But he has a set of legitimation mechanics, just as the American government has a set of legitimation mechanics, a set of people and interest groups that he has to answer to. And while he would like it to appear, especially to a foreign outside observer, that he completely dominates the system and is very powerful and that the party speaks with one united voice, in point of fact, as you develop a country, you create different kinds of vested elites that have benefited from the development. Those elites then tend to get in the way of further developmental moves that require taking money that has been allocated to them and moving it somewhere else. And that problem occurs in any kind of state, whether it's a democracy or it's an authoritarian state. If you grow really fast, you create a bunch of elites who then get in the way of further growth.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I think it's often confusing to some people when you talk about the kind of two main factions in the Chinese Communist Party and how there is a kind of power sharing, not all that dissimilar to what we have in the United States, where there's this kind of, it's a uniparty with two different factions, and then they switch sort of who's in power, and one side acts as a sort of check on the other, so that essentially the vested interests maintain getting all the things that they need, because there is a unified consensus generally, and then there's differences in terms of who gets what when, and that changes depending on what political winds blow, whether that's actually in a kind of liberal bourgeois election or if it's in a Chinese sort of democratic party election.
It's not that they don't have disagreement. It's that the disagreement is rendered invisible by the structure of their political system. Our system creates the appearance of disagreement even when there is none. Their system hides disagreements that do exist and do affect policy.
So I did, I guess I think I mentioned at the beginning, I did see you on, I think, a couple of different platypus panels. And so I do hear a kind of, when one of the reasons I like the Platypus Affiliated Society and Chris Cutrone and others is the kind of sort of realist perspective, but also like, let's not kid ourselves about like, a revolution is not, soon in the making. We are not really in a revolutionary moment. And the question then is, okay, what do you do when you're not sort of in a revolutionary moment? How do you understand things and things like that? I have been involved with far too many sort of leftist groups who at least act as if, we're just like one general strike or one cop killing a black person or something, just from like the whole system erupting, right? And like, I think you saw in 2016 when Trump was elected the first time, there was that like the idea that like, oh my God, this is the catalyst that's going to get people to, and I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. on the Women's March, and to me that was like, it was so funny. It was the next day where I realized, well, you got a couple 100,000 people really angry about what just happened on the mall. It would be able to overwhelm just about anything if they had any direction towards a kind of revolutionary, any sort of revolutionary impulse, and there's just none. Like it doesn't exist hardly anywhere, even if people are sort of angry. And so, the platypus sort of slogan is that the left is dead and long live the left. Another callback to Rome, I suppose. But is that the perspective that you kind of have in sort of principle? How do you feel about this, the notion that, at least you hear in Platypus, of like the left is a kind of, in my view, even, it seems like we're far beyond the new left. I think Chris Cutrone has lots of legitimate criticisms of the sort of millennial left, the hyper focus on the sort of language politics and the sort of performative aspects of politics, and really removing much of the sort of economic base, which is something that could potentially unite people who have diverse cultural or social perspectives, and because that's totally lost, any kind of potential for a robust, strong left seems pretty doubtful. And I think, we're talking on a podcast. You talked about starting a podcast to do it. There's a lot of commentary, but there's not a great amount of leadership. I think that's particularly notable in DSA, which is probably the most visible sort of left organization in the country. And it, to me, is in a sort of constant leadership crisis where it can't even sort of make any actions against the squad for its capitulations to the Democratic Party, and its nefarious votes on all kinds of things. And so that dovetails into a kind of the left generally, but also kind of revolutionary change. Is your perspective that in some ways that's sort of a pipe dream, and that we're maybe post-revolution in the way that somebody who might have been waving a red flag in 1870, and then, or like say 1871, or then 1917 or 1905 or something, that there seemed to be revolution in the air, whereas it doesn't seem like, at least in terms of socialist revolution, you're seeing much of that in the air at all today. How do you feel? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so the left is understood in the 20th century as dead. And it's dead in both the reform and revolutionary directions. The trouble is that when people realize that the 20th century left is dead in one of these directions, they then go, well, if it doesn't work in that direction, it must work in the other direction. So if I can see no possibility of reform, there must be a possibility of revolution. And if I can see no possibility of revolution, there must be a possibility of reform. And the thing that you come to second, you let go of with much more difficulty, because you've been backed into it. And if you go, well, that doesn't work, now you're really in trouble. Now you have to ask yourself, am I in a quietist position? Have I lost the ability to have a politics? And a lot of people, I think, especially in the States, we feel this moral obligation, if we're on the left, to have a politics that does something. Mm-hmm. And if you come to the position that there is no politics available to you that would do anything, it can produce a kind of identity crisis among people who have started to identify with their politics, and they view that their politics as the expression of who they are as an individual.
Yeah, it leads to nihilism in many cases.
Yeah, to a kind of, I think very often a quarter-life crisis, where all of these questions about life, which have been deferred by engagement with politics, must then be approached. So I think reform is kind of off the table right now because, for one, the left electoral political movements do not have any ability to win a majority in the United States. They can't win across the country. They can only win in very, very heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats in major cities. And if you look at the DSA endorsed, the Justice Democrat endorsed candidates, they, with very few exceptions, only win in not just Democratic safe seats, but gerrymandered Democratic safe seats that really should not exist. So they have no competitiveness. Secondly, their candidates are not left-wing in any meaningful way. The people who have been elected by the DSA have no loyalty to any particular DSA platform. There is no mechanism for making these candidates do anything. There's nothing that they have committed to. There is no platform or manifesto that commits them to concrete specific action. So as soon as they win, they start cooperating with the party establishment, which has much more resources and much greater ability to move them up in their careers than the DSA or the left do. And once they start cooperating, because there are no fixed standards for what counts as disloyalty, there is no way of making it clear whether or not they're still loyal. And so they can try to play it both ways. And then the people who desperately want to believe that reform can work because they've come to it as a last resort want to believe them. because if you don't believe them, that produces an existential crisis in your own life and a psychological unraveling. So there's a set of people who need to believe, AOC, that AOC is left-wing, because if they don't, it means that their whole life doesn't make sense. They don't know what to do, and they'll be lost. In point of fact, AOC has said that, in her view, Medicare for All is a negotiating tactic to get a public option. She voted to prevent railway workers from going on strike. She voted for Nancy Pelosi. She voted for Jeffries as speaker. There is not what is left-wing about this person, apart from the things that she says to convince you to continue to invest your time and money working on her behalf. Mm-hmm. There's nothing substantively left-wing about this person. On the other side, the revolutionary side, revolution requires not just 200,000 people that show up, but people who either have military training or people who can get people who do have military training to sympathize with them. Either you have to be, someone who's fleeing the front in World War I because you won't fight for your idiot Russian imperial commander anymore.
And you take your gun with you.
And you take your gun with you. Or you have to be someone in the army who, when you're told to fire on the demonstrator, goes, but they're like me. I care about them, right? The Women's March does not tick either of those boxes. None of the anti-cop demonstrations, they're not going to tick that second box.
Yeah.
They're not going to tick it. So when people are talking about these big demonstrations, either they need to have soldiers in them, or they need to have soldier sympathizers, and there's no effort made to make either of those things happen. The demonstrations have no potential. The factories, as we've mentioned before, no longer exist in these countries, so you can't shut down the factory. You can't do an effective kind of general strike in the United States. So if we're talking about revolutionary reform in the United States, I don't really see any possibility of either. So then you have people who make arguments for procedural reforms. They'll go, we could do reform if we fixed campaign finance law, or if we had the kind of electoral system that the Europeans have, if we had proportional representation, or if we had third parties, or a labor-based party, or what have you. Well, for one, to get those procedural reforms done, you'd have to already have power.
Yep.
Two, generally, if they're willing to make the procedural reform, it's because it won't help you.
Yeah, it's safe. It's not going to make a significant amount of difference. So then, okay,
right.
Sure, make the procedural change.
And then you look at the European countries. All of the European countries are slowly becoming more like the United States. They are all gradually moving to the right. And if you look at left-wing magazines, they're full of pieces about Macron is terrible, and Germany, they have no functional, the Die Linke is in trouble and they can't win elections. Oh, all of the center-left parties in Europe, their vote share has been decreasing continuously for 40 years. Even in the Scandinavian countries, there are cuts being made to basic social systems. There is no reason to believe that having a bunch of democratic procedures like you have in a European country would produce a major change in the direction of, say, European-style social systems. What I think we tend to see is that in European countries, proportional representation in large numbers of parties makes it harder for a single party to establish a strong governing coalition. So that makes it harder to do change. And that means that the set of programs that were created in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and in some countries, the 80s, those programs cannot be changed as quickly or as easily in Europe because the European political systems are vetocratic. They tend to produce gridlock. They promote gridlock in the absence of very strong consensus. That sometimes, in certain cases in European history, has led to the collapse of entire constitutions. When you get into a prolonged period of gridlock, sometimes a European country will throw out, say, France threw out the Fourth Republic in favor of the Fifth, or there will be some kind of authoritarian movement because the gridlock is so intense. And the relationship between the European Union and the member states is not as conducive to legitimacy as the relationship between the federal government and individual U.S. states. That relationship works in a more functional way for the purposes of legitimation. The European Union is more dysfunctional. So there may be more potential for fundamental constitutional change in the European Union because these reforms are less accessible through the ordinary political system. There's more possibility of, say, the breakup of the European Union or some kind of split in the European Union. But I think as we saw after the Euro crisis, even in the Europe, those things do not happen as easily as most commentators think they will. Lots and lots of mainstream commentators predicted that the European Union was going to dissolve and break into 1,000 little pieces. But what they didn't understand is, A, the consequences of leaving, and Greece doing something like a Grexit, were too devastating for the Greeks to countenance, even given how miserable they already were. They still imagined it could get so much worse that they would not do Grexit. And then, of course, there was enormous aid to the euro through the international banking system, through the Federal Reserve. So it wasn't something that could easily happen, even in Europe with the, I think, inferior from the point of view of stability. European countries have inferior political institutions from the point of view of manufacturing consent and legitimacy, which is why it appears all the time in Europe that the left has more traction. But in point of fact, that Europe is moving in the direction of the United States, but slower in a slower and more cumbersome way, because its institutions are, from the point of view of capital, less functional.
I mean, this sounds to me like a kind of, it could be labeled as a sort of capitalist realist perspective, right? The whole shorthand of saying we can envision the end of the world more than we can envision the end of capitalism. I mean, I don't know if you think that's fair or if that's an accurate description. I mean, to me, I don't totally disagree with all of that. I think that like there does not seem to be a lot of like opening for sort of movements to move the needle towards, whatever you might call socialism or something in the future. And so my sort of general perspective has been to maintain a kind of analytic approach to try to see the way the wind is blowing, but to recognize that it's not until the wind will really blow that people will start to move, right? As long as there is relative stability, and it's relative, there's still a business cycle, there's going to be recessions and things like that, but you don't get anything like even major reformist change until you have a crisis of the system in which you don't see the system being able to recover, and people then begin to explore whatever alternatives are kind of potentially on the table. Do you think, I mean, that, and so there is a sense in which you can take the accelerationist thing. It's like, okay, well, let's just heighten the contradictions in such a way. Let's watch in with glee as Rome burns. Let's start the fire that we know is always at a kind of constant, low rumble, and let's either wait or let's incentivize the system to go where it seems like it's headed, which is to collapse, right? The sort of capitalist realist will say, well, you misunderstand the real strength of this system and its ability to change and address these seemingly systemic failures with its own systemic sort of solution. And so in that sense, it could pull the wind out of the sails, even if they begin to blow, pretty considerably. I mean, 2008 was a major, major economic and financial crisis that, I think there was a lot of people, even, with Occupy coming up and stuff like that, that you did see. It seemed like a potential systemic failure, which has certainly had a lot of reverberating effects and hasn't totally been kind of fundamentally addressed. And so there are potential problems that may come from the sort of Band-Aid approach that was put to it. But there are not red lines, right? There's not mass unemployment in, the United States or something like that. There's not a breakdown of like shipping lanes, and so that you can't access your luxury goods in the US or something. And so it seems to me that until something like that happens, any opportunity for large, sort of left-wing organizations and political movements to actually come out and be, influential and move the needle. And so if you're in and sort of on the left right now, it doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense to even engage in a lot of that, unless it's just like honestly preparatory, and that you're kind of like, okay, we're just like positioning ourselves, to wait until the sort of whatever it is, the catalyst moment, so that we can just step in and be prepared. And so there's a part of that can be really, like you said, sort of deflating and psychologically damaging, in the sense it's like, well, then if I really have criticisms of this system, which I think is very much criticizable, I can't do anything about it. And so what's the point of being a critic and even being sort of on the left if I can't do anything about it until it starts to fall apart and there are bread lines and things like that. I mean, the softy in me says, I don't want bread lines because that's bad for people. But the sort of realist revolutionary in me says, well, there's fucking got to be bread lines because people won't, it's like it wasn't until there were bread lines that you didn't have 1905, or, it wasn't in terms of the war that you didn't have the Paris Commune. You need these like incredibly systemically destroying kind of events that even give you the potential to do something. And we're not there right now. And it seems hard to think if it wasn't 2008, is it climate change? I don't know. Like, I'm curious what you think about that.
Walter Scheidel in The Great Leveler argues that there are 4 horsemen of leveling, 4 things that can cause inequalities of wealth and income to collapse, but they are all only temporary solutions because it always tends to return. They are war, pandemics, revolutions, and state collapse. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic was not a sufficiently powerful pandemic to count as the kind of pandemic which has leveling effects. The Iraq War was not a sufficiently nasty war to count as the kind of war that has leveling effects. You need something like the bubonic plague or the World War period, both of them, not just the one or the other, but both of them to have that kind of effect. And so if we're talking about really big reductions in inequality, they probably involve some kind of major conflict that cuts world trade and cuts capital mobility down so that at that point assets become seizable by people and people are subjected to the kinds of pressures which motivates them to think about seizing assets. All this said, yes, I am influenced by the kind of liberal realist, capital realist stuff. I think that they have some very powerful arguments about the durability and tankiness of the system. The converse coin of this is that some of them, because they think the system is durable, they also think that maybe it's not so bad. Or the fact that it's able to reproduce itself means that people must not be that miserable in the first place. On the contrary, I think that this system is completely miserable. And I think what's amazing about it is how tanky it is, given how much it immiserates people and how thoroughly it immiserates people. So, of course, we can't normatively just stand by and do nothing or just wait around or accept the argument that it's going to take an exogenous event and that we just have to wait for some horrible, catastrophic exogenous event, because all of the events of the kind are horrible and catastrophic for this leveling to happen, especially because the history indicates that while these events will produce leveling for a time, they will not secure it. After the World War period, you had, 20, 30 years where inequality in the United States continued to decrease, and then it exploded open again, and at this point, it's very nearly as big as it was before the World War period. So you can have enormous amounts of misery and suffering and still end up right back where you started within 100 years. What kind of leveling is that? So even if you're banking on a war with China to produce leveling, you might be able to get leveling that way at enormous cost, and could you even sustain it across time? So I think there is an impulsion to continue to look for some kind of way of doing politics. The difficulty is you can't delude yourself into the idea that many of these different approaches that are available will work. So you have to be searching, but you have to be searching with this enormous skepticism in mind, because if you don't, the fact that you want there to be a solution because you are suffering, and because we are all suffering, we want a solution, that will impel us to waste our lives on stupid things that will not work. So by remembering the strength of the capitalist realist point, we are prevented from indulging our personal psychological needs with forms of political action that are a waste of time. But conversely, by remembering the Marxist critique, we do not become quietists and do not become willing participants in all of this. And so I think that there's a dialectic between those things that we can use to grasp after more effective ways of being political, but always with this question about it. So I do have some ideas about things that could be tried. I don't have tremendously high expectations for those things, but they're things that I think could be tried with everything that I've just talked about.
So I wonder if is that a kind of criticism, or is it a sort of support of the kind of what I would see, or I think it's relatively obvious that it is the kind of Gramscian or Frankfurt School shift in sort of approach to politics in some ways, right? There's this idea, at least in terms of the way it can be understood, what that whole project even sort of was the kind of acceptance that, okay, this is a much stronger system than we anticipated, and so we need to engage in the kind of politics that seems to be what gives it its strength, which does seem to be the kind of cultural production, the sort of hegemonic aspect of the sort of commonsensical way of understanding how societies work and our states are structured and things like that. And so that can be a kind of political battleground where we engage in very specific sort of efforts in order to undermine and find the sort of levers you can pull to significantly challenge this cultural hegemonic force that seems to be the thing that manufactures consent, and that seems, the whole education system that, as you described in terms of your own and was definitely mine, I've always said sort of makes a working class smart enough to run complex machines, but not smart enough to realize that at some points it's important to break them. That you get an intelligent, well-educated, trained up workforce, but that workforce has no real social or kind of cultural world of its own, that it just imbibes that from whether it's advertisement or churches or these sort of somewhat static cultural institutions that simply perpetuate that kind of manufacturing consent system. So there's part of me that thinks what you're saying is a sort of support of that idea that yeah, okay, like recognize it's not simply just going to fall apart and all you have to do is step in when it falls apart, but that you've got to pick your battles and engage where you think it's the most nefarious or what is being the biggest pillar of support. But the other one would be a criticism that says that's a waste, like some of that's a waste of time, and I think it has devolved into this like word game, word playing, a politics of language rather than serious challenges to the sort of pillars that maintain this horrible system. I mean, if your ultimate argument and your political message, because you see this sort of strong capitalist realism, that you say, well, what we really need then is more diversity on the boards of Raytheon, or something, that that is a political campaign you can do, and it seems somewhat successful to like move in that direction, but that is totally absorbable by that whole structure that manufactures the consent and that maintains that cultural hegemony. And so instead of actually fighting against it, you end up empowering it and making it seem less nefarious and less problematic, because you're actually winning these sort of small battles because you've decided not to engage in the big class war. So I don't know, is it a criticism, is it a support, or is it dialectical?
Yeah, nobody reads critical theory better than states. States are great at reading critical theory and going, hey, that's some good advice.
Yeah, the CIA loves that shit.
Genre has been replaced by critical theory. Yeah, that's its function at this stage, for the most part. What I would say, when it comes to the Frankfurt School in its early to kind of middle period, you might associate Adorno, Gramsci, Lukács, some of these guys in Western Marxism more broadly in this kind of interwar, around World War II period of the Frankfurt School. They were still very much interested in how the economy produces the culture and in the relationship between the culture and the system of political economy. Mm-hmm. And so when they were talking about trying to make cultural interventions, they were talking about making interventions in the system of cultural production, right? So if you were to say, radically overhaul the way that the arts are funded or the way that films are funded with an entirely different mechanism for raising money, which would give rise to kinds of films that are not possible in a film industry, which at this point has an economic incentive structure which impels it toward the superhero movie, right? If you change the way that films are produced, then you might get different kinds of films. What it has devolved into is a pure cultural critique about just what's being said and about language and about terms. It no longer really has anything to do with the way that things are produced, apart from who's producing them. Is it a person of the right demographic group who is doing the production? So it's no longer really interfacing with political economy in that kind of way. Even if we go back into the kind of Cold War, post-war era, what the Frankfurt School becomes is kind of Foucault on the one hand and Habermas on another. I see those as kind of the two paradigmatic examples of where it can go. So Foucault in the direction of, well, this is just how power works, and we can just analyze and describe how it functions, but it's not meaningful or possible to have a critique because we're all produced by it, and whatever it is that we would propose is just another iteration of it. And on the other side, a kind of Habermasian view, which revives a kind of progress narrative, capital law reason, marching through history kind of account, where if you construct the discussion in the right kind of way, the talking in the right kind of way, you'll get progressively better forms of talking or better kinds of moral or normative orientations. So I think both of those are dead ends that ultimately did come out of the Frankfurt School. But if you look into some of the earlier writers in the Western Marxist tradition, there is a lot of good and interesting stuff there. In particular, I'm a big fan of Adorno. I think he's lots of fun. I think Lukács is lots of fun. I think Gramsci is lots of fun. And there's a lot that can be taken there and used. So I do not want to suggest that the whole Frankfurt School tradition is to be shelved, but I do want to say that Habermas and Foucault are not very good outputs. And insofar as a lot of the stuff that we're doing is influenced by this discursive language theory kind of stuff, it's not constructive. And I don't think it's what people in the earlier part of that tradition would have wanted or would have been looking for us to do. And so to a large degree, those people have been misread or not read or replaced with other things that are doing facsimiles of what they purported to do. As far as there was another part to your question, but I've forgotten what it was.
I mean, the idea is like whether, like, how critical or how supportive of the dead end of the language games, and then the problematic aspect of the absorption ability of what seem like critical things to then become actually their own reinforcement mechanisms of the system. And so, I mean, largely, I think I agree with you in the sense that I'm internally frustrated by the sort of language games, because I don't think it really matters as much as people assume it does or seem to take it as. I think that
it's another one of those things that is psychologically comforting because it's an easy kind of politics to do. So once you get back to, well, something that you can do that has an effect that seems like, now you're back into the reform revolution game of convincing yourself that what it is that's available to you to do matters. And this is what we're always having to deal with. Whatever seems available to us to do as the last resort thing that we can do, we're very reluctant to admit that it's a waste of time. And whatever we come to last, that's the thing that we grasp onto more.
Well, and a lot of this has come to be sort of discussed as, and I think actually in some ways is a kind of policing. And so it begins this authoritarian kind of sense that says, like, there is a line, there is a way in which you must speak. And I think you've mentioned it too, that we in the United States have not often been branded on our tongues the way that people are in England in particular, where you can tell it's the moment a person talks, kind of their socioeconomic background. We're developing that now in the sense of it's generally kind of depending on how, not so much the accent you use, but the kinds of phrases that you say and words you don't use, and whether or not you add QIA to the end of LGBT, right? Or all these kind of, like, these indicators of a kind of where you are. I think in some ways in the professional managerial aspect of this. I mean, you had an interesting article in Sublation and a nice episode about education and the kind of odd role that plays, in the sense that there is this old notion of the kind of classical education as sort of making you smarter, making you a more well-rounded person, able to think, but that you sort of criticize that and say, well, a lot of times, I mean, if you were learning Greek and reading Plato, that wasn't always simply to make you smarter. It was as an indication that you were an educated person and will likely be in the sort of a certain kind of socioeconomic position. And that our universities today function exactly the same. They're the ticket to the job, and why, interestingly, especially given your background, how I'm sort of like, I think it's important that people are in some ways forced to take their general education courses, because there'd be a lot of people who would just do coding or, just do a STEM field and not read Plato at all, or not read, anybody. And of course, I'm somewhat biased because I spent 4 years just reading Marx and Plato and Aristotle and everybody, because I really just liked it. But it did also teach me how to think, and did eventually become a lawyer. And so it has, it's definitely, if you read enough Plato and Socratic dialogues, cross-examination becomes much easier in the courtroom, because you're so used to finding a way to get someone to admit a position that they didn't want to admit at the beginning. But that leads me in some ways. I mean, you can say what you want about the sort of failures of the economic or the education system to produce, I think, in some ways, even well-rounded people, and that maybe that's not even the goal or the role of it. But it's really a segue into, you started by saying, you started by reading Plato, Hobbes, and Marx. I've seen you, and even in the article about school, you mentioned, Plato and sort of Platonic, maybe even Neoplatonist kind of ideas seem to be part of how your approach, or sort of your general philosophical outlook. So to sort of switch gears a bit, I'm curious about that influence of Plato. Do you have still a kind of Platonic, Hobbesian, Marxian view of it? Did that ever kind of fade, or was that so kind of impactful at the beginning that, like you said, you read and they agreed with you, and maybe that sort of never left? Because I also I have an interest in Stoicism. I understand a kind of left critique of Stoicism as a way of saying, like, even if your life is shitty, you should not feel so bad about it. And I understand that criticism, but I think it's much deeper than that. And I read a lot of Nietzsche, and I really enjoyed the kind of criticism of the slave morality of Christianity and those kinds of things, and the interest and the utility of sort of even pre-Socratic Greco thought. And because I'll hear you talk about, the good and some of these more, what I would consider sort of Greco-Roman, really Greco kind of concepts that are not super in fashion, or maybe are coming back to a certain degree. There is, I think, a rise of interest in Stoicism, just like mindfulness. But I think also that is an example of the kind of cultural absorption that we were just talking about, that it is not Stoicism as a potential way of challenging the system. It is Stoicism as a way of saying, well, just accept it, right? Because you can't change it. And so I'm curious about your interest in those more philosophical ideas and the way that impacts, like, sort of how you think and the positions that you come to.
Yeah, Plato is still a very big part of my picture. I just had an article actually this month come out in the International Journal of the Platonic Tradition about Plato as a theorist of legitimacy. I am very keen on talking about Plato. Of course, you have to get to Plato. It takes a little while, because most people don't start with Plato. Most people, if they go to school, they do political theory. It's political theory from Hobbes. And they start with a set of empirical facts about the world, a set of conditions, and then that gives rise to behavior. And, that has its place. It's useful. But I find Plato indispensable. I find I can't do anything without Plato. Ultimately, I always need Plato. So, and Plato was the very first one that I read. I read The Republic before I read Leviathan, and then I came on to Marx. I read them in chronological order.
But you didn't read Aristotle's Politics.
I eventually did. I read Aristotle's Politics at University of Chicago, and Aristotle has a position in my way of thinking, but not as high a position as those three. So I would say, when it comes to Plato, Plato had a theory of class conflict. In the Republic, you have three different kinds of people. They are given different class positions, and the city unravels because those classes conflict, and the philosophical class is unable to manage the class conflict. And there are lots of different ideas in the Republic about how you might manage the class conflict. So, for brief overview for listeners, the three classes are: you have the wisdom-loving, philosophy-loving guardians, you have the honor, reputation, or status-loving auxiliaries, and then you have the pleasure-loving, pain-avoiding, wealth-seeking producers. And so for Plato, these three different people are interested in different fundamental values. So if you go into Adorno and Horkheimer, and this difference between substantive reason and instrumental reason, or substantive value and instrumental value. If you value something substantively, you value it for its own sake. If you value it instrumentally, it's because it will get you something else. The auxiliaries and the producers value everything in terms of the thing that it gives you in terms of reputation, status, or the thing that it gives you in terms of money, pleasure, right? So they have instrumental values, and they do not really have substantive value. They're not able to understand the value of the first principle for its own sake. They're not able to see how performing a craft, how you could perform a craft for the sake of doing it well, or doing it excellently, or to do a good job. When Marx talks about how you're supposed to live under communism, you're supposed to do all these different things, whatever you want, right? You hunt, you fish, you read philosophy. Well, why are you doing these things? It's not because you need to do them to survive or to make a living. You're trying to do them well. There's a need for that concept. If you don't have that concept, it doesn't make sense. And when you talk to people who don't have the concept of the good or of excellence or of doing something well, if you go, well, what if people didn't have to work because we had machines that made everything, and those machines were collectively owned by everybody, and everybody was able to therefore do whatever they wanted with their time? These people go, well, what would you do with your time? There'd be no point to life. For them, there's no point to life unless you're trying to obtain the means of subsistence, obtain comfort, right? Pleasure. Or, if you're a kind of a rentian who's into performance, there's no point to things unless you're being seen or being recognized. So there are some kinds of theorists who are producer theorists. They're theorists who are interested in pleasure and pain and how can you get these things. Hobbes is like that. There are some theorists who are auxiliary theorists. They're reputation theorists. They're just interested in status. I would classify a rent, for instance, in that category. Then you have theorists who understand the first principle and understand that it's important. And they call it different things. Platonists call it the good. You can find in some religious theorists that are sophisticated, God has the same meaning that the good has in Plato. And you can also find some people use capital T truth as a word for this. Gandhi, in particular, likes to use capital truth as the term and suggests that the good or God are faces or aspects or other ways of describing, right? So this principle is the kind of single principle that ultimately guides everything. So everything else that we do, every other concept we invoke, is a face or aspect of this principle. So if we say, well, what would be the prudent thing to do, or what would be the courageous thing to do, that shows you a certain aspect of the good, but in highlighting that aspect, it puts to the side other aspects. So when we talk about, in theology, there's cataphatic versus apophatic theology. Cataphatic theology is involved saying what exists, what God is, what is the nature of God. Apophatic is about what you can't say, or what can't just be put into words. Plato is very interested in the apophatic. For Plato, as soon as you try to describe the principle, you're making an imitation of it, and that involves distorting it. So as soon as you start to use words to describe what is good, those words, A, are not identical with the good, so they are already in and of themselves apart from it. And then B, there's an opportunity for them to be interpreted in ways which further distorts what is being said and further leads it away. So for Plato, the thing that has ultimate reality is this principle, and everything else that is many, is less real than it because it's an imitation of it. And so you could say, well, words, or concepts of many different concepts of the virtues, for instance, would be a level down, the many forms. Then you've got specific people that may or may not seem to have or embody those forms, right? And then you've got further imitations like artistic depictions that are people's attempts to create things that seem like people, that seem as if they have these concepts, that seem as if they relate to form. So you get a kind of ladder of reality that positions the things that we usually think of as being real, the physical stuff, as significantly less real than the principle which they imitate. And so the things that are to do with many are in some ways distorted because they are not one. So, for instance, the fact that we have many different perspectives, that there are many different people, and that we can't all benefit, straightforwardly and obviously from the same. If I eat a sandwich, it nourishes my body, but it doesn't nourish your body. And so it seems as if I get the sandwich and you don't, that I'm getting something and you're not getting something. That there are two different people, two individuals, me and you, and I've got something and you haven't. But that's just a function of the way matter is arranged. It appears as if I'm getting the sandwich and you're not, but really the universe is eating a sandwich. So if we go back to the one, we see how everything that everybody does is connected to everything everybody else does, that there are no individuals, that all actions come out of the one, and therefore nobody in particular is to be blamed or shamed or singled out as evil or the bearer of evil. Whatever is imperfect about the universe is in the whole universe, and when we act as if it's in particular people or groups of people, we're making a mistake. We're taking the appearance of many different individuals seriously, as if it were real, when that's an appearance that comes about through the way matter works. So this Platonic idea to me is absolutely indispensable because it vitiates liberal individualism, completely vitiates it, which I think is necessary to provide an account of what it is that we're trying to do in the first place with Marxism. What are we trying to do? Well, we're not just trying to make a world where you can do whatever you want. A world where you could do whatever you want is very boring. Sometimes it's hard for people to realize this because they're made to work all the time. And when they finally get some time off, to them it's a real relief. They get to go on a vacation, they get to really rejuvenate. But this is because they've been deprived of time that they could use to really become excellent people. At no point in their life have they really been given time. When you actually have real time, where there's no pressure on you to get a job, there's no pressure on you to strive for some kind of instrumental goal, reputation, pleasure, you have what you need, you're comfortable, you have friends, you have family, you have people who like you, your psychological needs are met. When you're in that situation, you then have to ask this question of, well, what should I do and why should I do it? And only aristocrats really, historically have asked this question because they're the only people who have been in this situation. And what Platonism does is it answers that question in a way that the theorists who are concerned with situations that are not yet on that level do not answer. Those theorists are interested in different things, in getting to different places, in part because those theorists are focusing on different parts of the journey, in part because many of those theorists don't have the first principle and don't understand it. And that's another valuable thing for me that comes out of Platonism. I can explain this to a lot of people, many times very precisely. A lot of people are never going to appreciate it. No matter how I put it, there are a lot of people for whom, well, isn't that just a bunch of bullshit? And aren't you just trying to get people to live the way that you want them to live? For them, there is nothing really beyond a motivational account of human behavior. You can say, well, you want this, you desire this. And so anything else that you come up with about shoulds or oughts, that's just a way of trying to get what you want. And in Plato's dialogues, there are characters like this. In the Gorgias, there's Callicles. In the Republic, there's Thrasymachus. These characters for whom, obviously everything Plato and Socrates are doing is just about trying to make people do what they want, because they're just control freaks and they're just trying to control everybody. The Cynics, Diogenes, he has this kind of view. So if you have that kind of view, there's nothing I can say to you that will convince you, because that view is premised on the idea that all language is just about doing rhetorical games, that it's all about trying to move people around psychologically or motivationally. That view excludes the possibility of the good in the first instance. So there's no possibility of a debate between those views. And what Plato ultimately realizes is it just needs to be accepted that some people are not going to have this concept. And yet those people have to be included in politics and in society and incorporated, and they have to be dialogued with, because if you don't, then you end up with kinds of cities where philosophers like Socrates get murdered.
This is where you have like the theurgic value, or the theurgic aspect, where you might have to set up a system where, given the fact that you have maybe some people who do understand this and might orient themselves towards it, what you need to do is come up with institutions and ways of thinking, or whatever, arts, culture, whatever, that will get those who are not necessarily focused on that might be oriented towards status or just getting the next thing or being recognized or whatever it is, that they will participate in a way that it almost seems indistinguishable from the person who is doing it for its own sake.
Yeah, you let those people get what they want in a way that's compatible with the maintenance of a system in which it's possible to do real philosophy and to actually pursue the principle. So you create these kinds of paths whereby an auxiliary or a producer type person can get what they want out of life sufficiently. That doesn't mean that they get absolutely everything that they want, because if you let them rule, then they'll collapse the space for philosophy. If you let the producers take over the academy, then they'll turn the academy into a pleasure production instrumental reason factory, right? So you can't let them control it, but you can allow them to get enough of what they want out of it that they will endorse it, and that allows it to continue. So the argument I make in that sublation piece is that giving people who want status and recognition a language through which they can feel superior to other people, or giving them a pleasurable college experience where they had a lot of fun and they made all their friends, if we're talking about on a more of a producer level, those things make those people support the university system. And then that is meant to leave open a space for some very small number of people to actually pursue the first principle. The issue, of course, with Platonism is that it is kind of taken for granted, I think, that very, very few people will get the first principle or have the capacity to do much of anything with it. And there may be a larger number of people than Plato assumed who have the capacity to get the first principle and do something with it. But I am not a spiritual egalitarian in the way that, say, Gandhi is. One of the things I have noticed is that there are brilliant people, very smart people, who do not have this concept and cannot be made to have it. And those people want different things out of life. And for them, it's clear and it's obvious that reputation and status and that those things matter, or that having a pleasurable life free of pain, that matters. And to them, those things are seemingly fully satisfying. They think that those things are what a human life is about. And they don't really get to the point of saying, well, is that not enough? Is there something else that we ought to be doing? I think, however, if those people get into positions of power and they start to structure institutions, then they make them very instrumental and they make them adhere to market logic. Because the logic of the kind of Callicles or the Thrasymachus is, well, we should just be doing whatever it is that we desire to do or want to do. And so if you accept a kind of set of democratic principles to go along with that, so Nietzsche, for instance, has a kind of authoritarian, there's an authoritarian reading of Nietzsche. But if you take a kind of democratic attitude, you go, well, every individual, may want different things. All of those things come from individuals. So whatever individuals want has validity because it comes from the individual, and the individual is the sovereign source of value, the thing which gives values meaning, right? This is the kind of, I think, paradigmatic liberal view. If it's the autonomous choice of an individual, if it pleases an individual, if it makes an individual feel seen or recognized, then that makes it valuable. It requires the individual being taken as the core thing. Mm-hmm. So once you make that move, well, then we have lots of individuals who want conflicting things. How do we manage that? Well, their answer is the market. The market is the principle which only appeals to what it is that particular individuals desire, and no exogenous higher abstract principles. Right? So if you take on board the liberal idea that you start with the individual, the market follows on directly from that, and you end up in this kind of system where every part of the society is structured on the basis of market logic and instrumental reason. A lot of people recognize that that's bad, but they still don't get the first principle conceptually. And if I start talking about Plato, they get upset and they don't understand. But they understand very well that when you have a society where all of the institutions are structured on the basis of what creates pleasure or what makes people feel good about themselves, that produces absolute horror and abominations. It astounds me how many people understand that, but don't understand that you need a first principle. The first principle is the thing that allows you to evaluate everything. It's the thing that we need to make evaluative statements.
Yeah. So seeking in terms of a Platonic communism to explore it, right? I mean, there's obviously, God knows how much ink has been spilled on the whole Guardians living, without possessions and in barrack style communal living and things like that. There's this sort of communism in Plato you'll hear in, I think, a very basic way. But I think hearing you if Plato is correct in the sense that, and maybe even be incorrect as to the small amount of people who really would be the kind of philosopher kings, guardians in a society, that a society that had those people kind of at the helm, had the sort of Platonic republic, if the sort of communistic intervention in there would be to say, hey, wouldn't you have those people creating the kind of theurgic system where the people that are not focused on the first principle and doing things for their own sake or the good, and that good being a more polis-oriented good rather than the kind of individual-oriented good, the good of like the society and of the whole, that then they would construct a system that would allow people to pursue their sort of status or whatever, but in a context where all of that would still be oriented towards the good, whatever kind of form or whatever that would take. And so you can see, I think there's like sort of criticism or a hyper-realist criticism of the Soviet Union as sort of attempting that kind of model where you have, there's this notion where we'll have sitting atop our society this institution, the party, which will not be oriented just towards like satisfying this kind of thing, but is oriented towards the great ideal, the great good of sort of, post-capitalist, hyper-abundant, equitably distributed goods and services, and allowing people the space to be able to pursue whatever it is that they think is valuable. And that the idea would be to create a system in which the party was able to identify those who were the guardians, for lack of a better term, and then put them into the positions of power such that they would then, you have this kind of nearly or potentially incorruptible upper kind of strata that, because they're oriented towards the good, there's this safety against the sort of widespread corruption and the continued orientation towards finding the ultimate goal. Then, of course, you come back and say, well, if we look at communist parties throughout history, they don't tend to be able to they might identify the most advanced layers of the working class, but there's a difference between being a sort of person who understands the social, economic, and cultural history and way things work and being oriented towards the good. And so I'm doing a kind of thought experiment on the fly of saying, all right, is it possible in some ways? Do you think it is coming from the other side of you, which is that hyper-realist? Is that idea something that actually might have legs, in that if you did really have this organization that was capable of identifying those who were really able to see good and to put them in positions of authority such that they were able to construct the rest of it, is that, dare I say, the kind of ideal model for someone who is at one time very interested and may even adopt the label of a Platonist or a Neoplatonist or whatever, but also interested in the sort of traditional kind of communist things about at least more equitable distribution of the goods, the hyperabundance that separates us from the sort of scarcity justification for the kind of decisions about distribution and production that are supposedly made. I wonder, is that just sort of hyper idealistic and utopian to not be useful, or is that actually a potential orientation, at least philosophically, that you could have in terms of arguing for what the kind of state or republic you'd want to actually see?
Yeah. So a lot of people, when they read the Republic, they get kind of caught on the specific schema that they come up with and the degree to which that schema strikes us as straightforwardly unrealistic. I tend to focus more on, for Plato, what matters is the good and not the specific manifestation. The specific manifestation is only justified insofar as it's good. So there's no reason in Platonism to marry yourself to any particular formulation of the city in terms of institutions, structures, rules, norms. People, left critics have this problem with Confucius as well, but also with Plato, of these are theorists who are trying to describe how you would even come up with rules in the first place. The specific rules that they lay out may strike them as beneficial in their own time and place, but part of what is in the theory is this idea that you have to change and update rituals and rules periodically to meet new conditions and circumstances. So whatever it is that would have worked in Greece, obviously, isn't going to work now. And Plato even says, there's a Phoenician story that the Phoenicians, were told that motivated them to support a particular kind of city. But in Greece, that story won't be believed. You can't tell it. People remember the discussion of noble lies, but they forget the part where Plato says, well, you can't possibly get away with that here. Right? In some ways, paradoxically, I think we've become more acquainted with noble lies under liberalism. Liberal capitalism is much more able to spread noble lies effectively than you could in ancient Greece.
And this whole idea that people are different in different places in different times is a common theme in terms of political analysis. You get that in Marx, in Montesquieu, in a lot of different places. It says, yeah, look, like people are different. They lived at different places. They have different histories. And so the way in which even their sort of orientation might be towards the form of the good, but the way it would actually mediate in reality is going to be determined based on an innumerable number of things about the society and the individuals who occupy it.
The manifestations of being will be many and varied, and all depending upon how the good can most effectively come into existence in this imperfect kind of world that we live in. You could find Byzantine emperors love to invoke Plato and suggest that they are performing this kind of role or function. So you can find it not just in Soviet political theory, but in Byzantine imperial theory. It can be kind of paired with lots of different institutional schemes in people's minds. I think the thing that really makes this interesting is if you then pivot back to the Marxism. If you pivot back to the Marxism, the way that you have institutions select for particular kinds of people is with incentive structures that divert people down different paths depending on what sort of person they are. You make it such, in the American electoral system, you can only win if you're the kind of person who can win an election, which means you have to be capable of doing the kinds of things that are necessary to win. You have to be able to not only identify what those things are, but bring yourself to do them. You have to have a certain way of being in the world to be an American electoral politician. And that way of being in the world is incompatible with lots of different good things. And Plato says this about the orators in Athens, that the incentive structure that governs the orators, the talkers, is so toxic and nasty that to be a successful orator in Athens, you have to be a bad person. You can't possibly be a good person. So you can imagine, of course, if you design institutions where you can only be successful in the institution if you are the right sort of person that the institution is selecting for, that is, I think, a more effective kind of model than what some people imagine, where it's a bunch of wise men judging the souls of particular people, or a Byzantine emperor judging whether his son is really a good person or is really up to snuff. That's not going to work. And Plato says in the Republic that the thing that will ultimately bring this system down is that eventually they will fail to identify the replacements for themselves. They will not be able to pick. They will make mistakes. They will get it wrong. And he, even makes reference to absurd ways of picking, trying to use astrology and charting the births of people and all sorts of fun stuff. It's very difficult to pick. The way you do it is you use political economy. You create economic systems that promote particular kinds of people and divert other kinds of people down life paths that they find interesting but don't threaten the system. And this is what our system does. It sustains itself in large part by ensuring that only the kinds of people who will cooperate with it get into positions where they can direct it, and other kinds of people are diverted into lives that satisfy them enough to shut them up and get them out of the way, right? So that's why at every point the dissident is offered numerous ways of wasting their life, numerous ways of blowing off steam uselessly that will be psychologically satisfying to them, but will not ultimately produce change. So if you really bring Platonism and Marxism together, they supplement each other very well. But people don't want to do this. They are turned off by Platonism because they view it as elitist, or they don't get the first principle and therefore they can't sign up to it. And this also has implications for thinking about working class mass politics. If you need people to be able to get something, and a lot of the time Marxists and left-wing theorists are trying to get people to buy into a certain vision of life. If your vision of life requires concepts that the people you're talking to don't have or view with skepticism, and workers have a lot of reason to view the good with skepticism because their life is so thoroughly alienated from any possibility of striving after it. The only way that you can get through life, if you're a worker or a professional, regardless of where you're at, is to rationalize the situation that you're in and to persuade yourself that the things you are able to get are the things that are good for you that you ought to pursue. And that's how the people in lower classes and societies cope with the system. They convince themselves that being able to retire one day makes a life of toil worthwhile, or that being able to make it to the weekend or go home and watch a sports game is what makes life worthwhile, or going off and joining their fandom, or working for a tech company that is producing the future. Whatever it is that you think that you're doing, you convince yourself that that's really what life is about and not the first principle. So if you start talking about the first principle, you're going to run into the fact that there's enormous amounts of psychological cope going on, because very few people pursue the first principle. Very few people can pursue it. They lack the means to pursue it. And so it is important to them to deny that it exists or to conceptualize it in such a way that it's accessible to them when it really isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more with that. So, okay, I have three different questions. They're somewhat separate from each other. And I know I've already had you for an hour and a half, but I want to at least touch on these. I remember, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was in a platypus panel or something like that, that you had made a few, I don't know if disparaging is the right word, but I'd say somewhat critical comments about anarchism and anarchists, or maybe just anarchists and not so much anarchism. It wasn't totally clear. So I'm not sure if that's from personal experience trying to work with anarchists and the somewhat difficulty that can be, or some sort of deep-seated philosophical and or political kind of gripes with the sort of basic thrust of sort of anarchism. And I'm curious about this because my entrance into this was from a kind of anarchist thing, just have a seemingly dispositional relation to power of constant adversary. I have a good work ethic because I got that good old Protestant work ethic, sort of built into me. But I am a horrible employee because I do not relate to power very well, and so anarchism was always something that did speak to me in its sort of in the, whether it's sort of Kropotkin or Bakunin or something, very much sort of critical of power itself and the manifestation of that in the sort of modern nation state and the sort of nefarious role that it plays, regardless of even its sort of relative economic orientation, that it does seem to be that any institution of any sort of significant size and or power does seem to me to develop its own kind of interests and then does pursue those kind of interests. And because there's this standard Marxist line that the state is really just the sort of institution that maintains class dominance. And the anarchists totally disagree with it. And they say, no, the state does play this kind of unique role, as does any kind of powerful enough institution that's big and diverse enough and potentially bureaucratic that it will develop its own internal kind of interests and then pursue those to the degree that it can. And that's still very much salient to me. I'm I just have my eyebrow raised to any sort of large institution because they do seem to like problematically follow a certain set of interests. They may align and may not align with the sort of general capitalist sort of mode of production or whatever, but they so my sort of politics has always been sort of more decentralizing, more interested in that aspect of all of this. I was always interested in the kind of like fully realized communism for its notion that you would not need this state apparatus because you'd have different kind of incentives like you were talking. I mean, to me, that was always what was really attractive. And to me, it was always like, you had to be really worried about the socialist phase, right? If you could manage that and got to that communist phase, that's where I really want to go. And that socialist phase is going to suck because you're going to have to pull everybody, and you're going to have to like mandatorily change institutions against people's already existing interests, who will then, you know, like rise up against it. And you're going to have this constant like fights, and it's like going to suck. And so that's why I was always like, both I always didn't mind the shock value of it too, but to like to say I'm more communist than I was a socialist, not realizing that in the way people are using that, socialist means like somebody who's willing to go to an election and like the Socialist Party rather than the communist parties who are more Leninistic. And so I made that sort of mistake and whatever. And so all of that has come for me now as a kind of orientation towards cooperatives, both because that's something you can actually do and build now. It does give a representation of workers sort of owning the means of production, a democratic introduction of democratic institutions into a place where authoritarianism is still the norm, the workplace, and the place we spend most of our time. And so that, at least as I realize and agree with you that the revolution is either indefinitely in the future or is so far in the future that I might not see it in my lifetime, and that I'd like to build something that would be at least, you know, a step in the direction that I want to go. So my interest is in kind of worker cooperatives. I host another podcast called All Things Co-op with Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work network that's like focused on cooperatives and its relationship to socialists. The goal there is to get people who are interested in socialism to understand the nuances of cooperatives, and the people who are interested in cooperatives to see its relationship to sort of Marxist or socialist or left-wing anti-capitalist sort of perspective. So it's a long question. I'm shoehorning two of the things I wanted to get your perspective on, which is, what's your view on anarchism? It doesn't seem to be super positive. And then the second part of it being your sort of view on worker cooperatives as at least something we can do right now. It is certainly not the silver bullet to the, you know, the big R revolution, but it is something that we can do now that is, at least at the smaller scale, a kind of way of saying that we can point to something and say, well, that's something like what I'm wanting to build, rather than simply bitching all the time about all the stuff that everybody kind of recognizes sucks about capitalism, but don't see a way out of, you know, that they're wholly in capitalist realism. If we can poke a hole in that bubble by showing successful worker cooperatives or a network of cooperatives or like a Mondragon writ large or something, that I think could be highly effective towards at least decreasing the kind of disgust factor that you often get with people when you're talking about, you know, socialism or communism, because, you know, people have a million definitions of what that word, you know, means.
Yeah. So when it comes to anarchists, I have met anarchists I like. My best friend at University of Chicago was an anarchist. I like Gandhi. Gandhi's interesting, and he's an anarchist.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a critique of what I kind of consider paradigmatic anarchism. And what I would say paradigmatic anarchism is the idea that the problem with the society is that it doesn't fully embody the French revolutionary principles. So it is not actually a free society. It's not actually an equal society. It's not actually a representative society. And that those values have to be realized in their totality. So what the anarchist does is defines these terms, which the bourgeois state uses to legitimate itself, in such a way that they can never be used for legitimation because they're so demanding it's not possible for a state to live up to them. The anarchist then condemns all states for not living up to the pure versions of these principles. The thing is, those principles are created to serve the bourgeois state. They are articulated in ways which ultimately defend the bourgeois state, and the anarchist is never in a position to compete with the bourgeois state and its servants for defining the terms. And whenever an anarchist tries to define equality or liberty or representation in a demanding way, ultimately what happens is that the rich people use institutions and structures, which anarchists don't like to build, to defeat those efforts to capture those terms. So a great example recently would be equity, right? Anarchist definitions of equity, it's something resembling equality of welfare for all individuals. But at this point, what equity means is eliminating the racial wealth gap. And there's a process by which the term came to mean that. And it's a process of academics, institutions, rich people seizing control of that term, appropriating it, and using it. And so all of the kind of term language stuff, one of the things I think those people really miss is you're on a terrain where the capitalists are heavily advantaged, because if you're talking about how to make a word mean something in society, well, if they control the means of disseminating media, if they control the media outlets, the magazines, the newspapers, if they fund the academics, if they have think tanks, if they have all of these organs, then they're going to be able to define the term however they want. And what they'll do is they'll take the radical signifying quality that equity has, and they'll leverage that to make a term that is not very radical seem radical. And so all the anarchists will have done in trying to make equality demanding by turning it into equity is to have given the state a new tool in legitimating itself. So there's that issue. Secondly, generally anarchists are very individualistic and buy the idea of the individual as the first principle of analysis. And because they buy the individual as the first principle, they tend to buy the market. And we see this in the cooperative, because in the cooperative, the focus is on the boss, getting rid of the boss, getting rid of the owner, having collective ownership. But what does the cooperatively owned business operate within? Within the market. The market system is not touched by the cooperative scheme. So what happens is, because the business is still in the market, it has to conform to the logic of the market to survive. So if a co-op is to survive, it must find a way to incorporate a sufficient level of capitalist logic that it will be competitive in a market environment. So how is it going to do that, given that it's spreading power democratically? Well, what it will do is it will turn the workers on each other. The workers become each other's bosses. They are all each other's bosses. So now they don't experience each other as colleagues or as, in a solidaristic way, as part of a shared struggle. They're each other's bosses, and they're worried about being judged to not be pulling weight, because every person in the workplace they interact with is only in part a coworker, but always also a boss. They also do a kind of partition inside the worker's own mind, where the worker is both having to think as employer and as employee at the same time. So now the worker's employee part is being oppressed internally by the employer part. And so in this way, the worker is turned psychologically against themselves on an individual level, in addition to being turned against their coworkers who were previously all together with them in a struggle against a boss, and now are all judging each other for not pulling weight. And the issue is, as long as a co-op operates in a market, it must function this way. Otherwise, the business will not produce enough, competitively enough, to survive. And this, for me, is the fundamental issue, because anarchists do not critique the idea of the individual because they buy liberal legitimating concepts. They are not able to full-heartedly critique the market, and it gives way to kinds of market socialism and forms of socialism which accept, integrate, tolerate the market. The critique of the market is an incredibly powerful tool, because that's the critique of instrumental reason and the critique of the forms of life wasting that occur. You can be in a cooperative and you can still waste your life. In fact, not only will you waste your life in a cooperative, but you'll hate yourself while you do it, and you'll be in a more antagonistic relation with everybody around you. If the co-op works. Of course, if the co-op is doomed to fail because it's too nice a place, then it will be very pleasant, and it will make people feel like this form of organizing has hope, and they'll go, oh, it's just too bad it didn't work out. We'll just have to try again, harder, better, faster.
So, I mean, I'm curious to the degree that you're familiar with like Robin Hanel's participatory economics, where you might have firms, that are more cooperatively run, but that their output is not necessarily, and their inputs and outputs are not subjected to like straight up market interactions, where it becomes participatory kind of up the chain, where so you have individually in terms of like the actual productive capacity of whatever the firm is actually oriented towards doing, then outputs it puts its outputs into a system that is also participatorily engaged in, that does allocation in a different method that simply than like the exchange of some kind of abstracted value, via money or something. That's of interest to me, because I agree with the distorting aspects of the sort of capitalistic market on cooperatives, and I agree. I think it's one of the reasons why it's at least very difficult to make a large cooperative, and that even if you look at Mondragon and things like that, they do operate very capitalistically, at least at a certain echelon. Now they are a much better business to work at overall, but they still are adopting that kind of logic and have to participate in ways that are potentially counter to the underlying values that they supposedly are trying to embody. But in some ways, I do think that it is at least whatever bifurcation happens in the individual's mind, obviously as complex as individuals are, that is often highly obscurized and not something that is so obvious, because that I think if you do talk to most cooperatives, even cooperatives that are relatively successful, the equal exchanges and some other relatively large, even in Mondragon, you will find that potential kind of seeming dissonance between being the employer and employee is not as problematic as it may seem, and it doesn't act in this kind of like debilitating or frustrating kind of way, because it actually the ability to play both of those roles orients your relationship to what you are doing in a way that does not make it as alienating. And so there's just this it has been my experience talking to a lot of people who are actually in the kind of game, that there's a recognition that there is this or like a sort of at the beginning or as you enter it, a kind of weirdness where you don't know what role you're supposed to play and all this kind of stuff, but that mediates over time and becomes a kind of non-dissident producing sort of dualistic dialectic that you might have to deal with in your own head. So it can be helpful.
Is a problem. That for me is a problem, because the market is supervening on these people. So if they're aware of it, and if they can challenge it, and if they can articulate, hey, I'm having to take on the role of an independent contractor or a self-employed or a small business owner, I'm having to cognitively do some of that. If they're aware of it and recognizing it, then they can be concerned about that, because I don't think it's a particularly good thing to be a small business owner in capitalism. I don't think that's a wonderful experience. I think that there's lots of problems with the way that the petty bourgeois as a class think. But this invitation to think as petty bourgeois, which is initially encountered as a little bit disturbing, you quickly acclimatize to it when you put in a new class position. You quickly learn to think in terms of that. So then the market gets another layer of cushioning and defense around it, because if you have large numbers of people in cooperatives who experience themselves as worker owners, they will be more willing to tolerate the market, because the relationship has now been obscured in such a way that it's more acceptable to them.
Well, I think, I even will a certain level of sort of market acceptance, though I obviously take the position that I would prefer more participatory economic interactions, specifically for the fulfillment of, in some ways, like sort of non-luxury goods. I'm not super opposed to some way like sort of market interactions for non-necessities, but like when it comes to the distributions of the basic necessities of life, to unshackle the gaining of those absolute necessities from having to work for someone and rent yourself and things like that. If you could decouple that, I do think that there's still problematic aspects of the market. But if you demarketize the basic necessities to allow people more freedom to pursue those kind of the things that are more interesting to them, then it seems to me that the market would, and I'm still talking about a like highly regulated market and things like that, a very controlled kind of thing, but one that at least for, again, non-necessities and not electricity, healthcare, these kinds of things, but for some random commodities that people might like enjoy consuming, but are not necessarily necessities, to subject those to a kind of marketized relationship, to me seems a lot less nefarious than subjecting everything to marketizing relationships, which is that's the sort of core problem with the market as I see it, is that it because it so well aligns with that liberal idea that it is this totality that is placed upon everything, that like, do you have a problem with something? Well, subject it to market forces, because then it'll magically essentially produce, via the invisible hand or whatever, produce the kind of things that you want, right? That is a very problematic and untrue and distorting kind of notion, but it's very prevalent. So to me, it's like the market is in and of itself, to me, not necessarily something that is like problematic if contained and limited to a certain sort of area, and not universalized where it becomes really noxious and really like disorienting for people, because they are constantly subjecting themselves to these forces rather than only having to be subjected to that in a kind of non-necessity, or that they're sort of, they realize they're engaging in it rather than it being the water they swim in. So I don't know if you think that that's too narrowly focused or something. Curious.
Well, certainly calling for getting markets out of certain parts of the economy is better than not calling for markets getting removed from any part of the economy. And I have anarchists that I like, and I know that they're trying to help. I think what frustrates me about that position is that it takes on board the liberal idea that we should be getting what we want, right? So a lot of the time when we're talking about luxury goods, we go, well, we need a market so that people can get what they want, because we take it for given when we're talking about luxuries that people ought to get what they want. And I don't think that that's always the case. Consider, for instance, movies, right? What people have been wanting is big, distracting superhero movies that are a form of entertainment that involve a lot of state ideology that's comforting, but which doesn't invite them to think. And the film industry, because it's run in a market, gradually the number of studios has contracted. There's only a handful of big studios now, and they all recognize that making certain kinds of movies they can make a ton of money on, and other kinds of stuff is risky because it involves trying to make something controversial that too narrow a slice of the audience will appreciate. If you make something controversial, it better be the kind of thing that can win awards from the Academy. It better be status-oriented, auxiliary-oriented, or it's not going to work as a movie. So it becomes very difficult to fund movies that are just good or interesting, and even insofar as you can fund them, it's very difficult to get them seen or to get them made available to people. So for instance, in that area, I think some kind of single-payer system for movies in which there is some kind of formula for calculating compensation that limits the top end of it to prevent huge, enormous amounts of entertainment industry money from being dumped into superhero movies would be a good thing. But that would require essentially what Republicans would consider a government takeover of the film industry. So I think that there are lots of different areas of what we would call luxury or entertainment, where even today, under present circumstances, it's easy to make an argument that we ought to change the system of cultural production. And I think part of what we're having in terms of our political problem, in terms of trying to pursue effective types of electoral reform, or of electoral movements that might pursue left-wing reform or non-reformist reform, a big part of the problem is that as the unions have fallen away and become focused on the service sector and so less effective at leading strike activity, more and more of the leading in the left is being done by media people, by people on I did it, podcasts, people writing for newspapers and magazines, people who are on television, potentially not very many of them, but they're media people principally. And because they're media people, they function in accordance with the entertainment marketplace that is our media marketplace. And increasingly, all of our news, all of our information is dictated by the need to be entertaining, by the need to make money through the market system. And because of this, we have a population that gets information based on what will get it to click, not based on what will help it to think about things. And that is fundamentally a market-caused problem that could only be resolved by through the kinds of reforms that would first require doing away with the system of entertainment political media that we have. And I meet so many people who want to make a difference in this space by starting a better kind of magazine or starting a better kind of podcast. The issue is, if it becomes something that you make money from, then the fact that you make money from it will start to have an incentive effect on you that will eventually impel you to produce whatever it is that people click on. Mm-hmm. A great basic example of this is the History Channel. The History Channel used to make really interesting documentaries way back in the 90s. And then the History Channel gradually found over time that documentaries about World War II always performed better than documentaries about anything else. So there was a period, maybe you remember it, for about 10 years, where they only made World War II documentaries and nothing else because the market says that's all anybody wants.
Yeah.
So that's all you ought to make, right? Kind of like superhero movies. Then they got to a point where they realized actually people like conspiracy theories and gobbledygook even more than they like World War II documentaries. So they just started making reality TV conspiracy theory shows that no longer even performed a function of informing people. When you have entertainment outlets and media outlets that are subject to the market, they can't produce anything edifying. They can't. And at this point, the only ways of getting published outside of that schema is in, say, the academy, which has its own set of problems, not least to do with institutional access, with where the funding comes from, with how you have to behave and how you have to talk to be able to stick around. So there's, because of the market, even these things that we may think of as luxuries or not things that are essential or that people would have a right to, become very important. And that's where I think a lot of the Frankfurt School critique of the culture industry stuff is really indispensable. We have to apply the critique of the market, not just to the basic necessities, but to a significant number of other things. There may be some things that you could get away with having a market on if everybody already had a living standard where everybody could do more or less whatever they wanted to do. And some people just like competing in a market and running an ersatz business that they don't need to run because that's what they value and that's what they like. And the only way that you can get those people to be okay with the system is to give them an opportunity to run a fake business, a lemonade stand of something. I could see a market in a kind of supplementary ideological role for such people, but I don't think it should be providing anything that's important.
That's food for thought, I guess I would say. Okay, so we're hitting the 2-hour mark, and I suppose at what you said too, that's where I have to mention that go to Patreon or something. But I don't do this podcast for money, which is why it doesn't have the high production value. But I find that the conversations tend to be more interesting, and so I appreciate you doing that. I have one more question, and it potentially is a big one, but really because I'm interested in your perspective on sort of things, and I wonder what you think of this sort of theory that I've thought of. I've seen a few other people have the same kind of perspective, but I want to subject it to a kind of, dare I say, Maoist type of constant critique or whatever. But it's World War II specifically. Basically, the question of fascism, the rise of fascism in the kind of interwar period, and then the idea that World War I or World War II is this kind of defeating of fascism by liberal democracies on one side and by sort of Soviet communism on the other. That's, your sort of traditional thing, the war to save the world from fascism, and whether that was, Japanese imperialist fascism or whether that was German sort of racialized Nazi fascism. And then there's a whole lot of discussion about the fascism that exists in Italy, because it isn't as easy to see, in my view, how different it is from the adoption of a lot of different things in the Soviet Union and in the United States and basically everywhere, which is the foundation of the kind of theory, which is basically that in the Depression period, when you have the boom that comes after World War I kind of decreasing, all of the, World War I obviously did not end the imperialist competition. It maintained, and World War II is the second round of one long war that had a 10-year armistice, basically. But you have this approach. At that time, worldwide capitalism, imperialist capitalism, is essentially sort of failing in the form of the Depression. And there are sort of necessary solutions to deal with that problem. And the original sort of, Hooverite perspective in the United States was, okay, it's the laissez-faire-ish kind of let it happen, let it go through, we will recover, it's just a big dip in the business cycle, it's cool. The FDR approach, I think even encouraged by sort of socialists and communists, was to stabilize the system. And that fascism, is often just suggested or analogized to be the kind of ring that's placed around a barrel that's sort of exploding because of it's got internally combustible things. And fascism can be this kind of rail that says, okay, when you've got a worldwide or a countrywide depression, the state can come in, the state can prop up sort of traditionally still like privately held, but can like orient and invest in certain ways to like make this bridge between large corporate entities and the state apparatus, and that it is not necessarily, it's like it can be political, kind of institutionally agnostic, in the sense that it could take the form of a very single hierarchical authoritarian single party regime that you'd see in in Germany, and I think even in the Soviet Union, in its sort of push to state capitalism and socialism in one country. Not necessarily having to deal with the depression, like because they didn't have it as much in the Soviet Union, but only because they were already doing the kind of repair work that fascism was doing to address the depression. So the basic idea is that the depression causes almost everyone, especially in the developed world, to adopt fascism. And that what happened, so that's the United States, it's Britain, it's sort of everywhere. The difference is that in Italy and in Germany and Spain, you have outright people saying that that's like what we want to do. It's like our political ideology, and we have a kind of political system that we are seeing as the most effective way of imposing this stabilization mechanism on capitalism, limiting, or if not eliminating the class struggle by reorienting that, what has caused so much problems in terms of the class struggle into these images of creating a resurgent and rejuvenated nation state or culture or whatever it is. And that takes on noxious forms in Germany, in some ways less noxious, but still bad in Italy and Spain. And then, but it's relatively universally adopted. And that, so, I mean, you look at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and it was like all built in the 30s, all during this period of time, in my view, which is a transition to sort of fascism, which in the United States takes the form of a managed liberal democracy with two sides just switching, but that the overall consensus is this kind of fascistic perspective that the nation state government is there to maintain a kind of corporate system to be able to maybe limit, not eliminate monopolies when it's beneficial, but to make sure there's oligopolies and sort of small, so that there is this notion of competition, but that we can orient it with our investments. And so we'll build the National Mall with fasci everywhere and Greco-Roman architecture, because we're hearkening back to the grand days of the Roman Senate. And then because it's still engaged in this larger international imperialist competition, all these different fascist organizations fight, that they engage in conflict because of the logic of the necessity for imperialist territory gains, basically. And like, again, I think its most noxious form is Nazi Germany, but I fundamentally don't see a huge difference between the kind of orientation of the state to corporations and the need to save capitalism, stave off communist and like particularly Bolshevik sort of revolutions, and to stabilize the economic system by finding a mechanism to limit the class struggle. In the United States, that's the Works Progress Administration, the Civil Conservation Corps, and some of these things that you'll even hear left-wing people talk about, like that were so great about the FDR and the New Deal. To me, the New Deal is the movement of America from its sort of laissez-faire, weird pre-New Deal system to a fascist one, and that it happens sort of everywhere, and that World War II is essentially an inter-fascist war in which the most noxious form, Germany, loses, and in Japan, sort of they lose, but that there's no defeating of fascism. That fascism remains. That that's like the actual system that the world has sort of adopted, and it just it sort of has different veneers, different sort of political veneers and stuff like that. But stability, state intervention, propping up of sort of government and that cadre of people who benefit from that, whether that be arms manufacturers or certain, important producers of what would in the Soviet Union have been the commanding heights, that would have taken over or something like that. And, to me, China, same kind of model, just, authoritarian state-owned enterprises, or, a very Bonapartist, fascist takeover that happened in the 30s, that World War II didn't end. It simply allowed its worst form to sort of be defeated. So its nicer form, it's like fascism with a human face form, is able to thrive and become the sort of worldwide system that might be, as some would argue, the sort of last stage of capitalism, that's the iron bar that needs to hold, and it may hold for a very long time. That and to go back kind of to the very beginning, that could be, or I would argue, I want to hear your response, that the structure, the strength of the system as it exists now is actually not so much because capitalism itself is a very strong one, but that fascism tends to be a very effective model for clamping down on the class struggle and even maintaining the sort of overall system, even if it is still going to encounter, hiccups, they would say, or a business cycle or chaos or ups and downs. So I'm curious, that's, again, somewhat off the cuff, and that's just something I think about. I've heard a few people say something similar, but it doesn't, it's a little provocative to say that, we live in a fascist country and fascism won World War II, but I don't think it's actually all that incorrect. But I want to hear your thoughts, either that you just completely agree and I'm right on the money, or that there's problems with it.
Yeah, a lot of Frankfurt School theorists made this kind of argument that the New Deal was a kind of softer version of what was going on in Germany and
social
Italy and
fascism.
Spain. It depends a lot on how you define the terms, and there are some instances where you may want a very wide definition of fascism so that it encompasses the modern state as it interacts with capitalism, the kind of post-30s modern state. And that's kind of the wide definition that I'm hearing, a definition in which if you have a modern state and you have capitalism and you have kind of post-30s bureaucratized structures through which you administer it in such a way that you calm the social consequences of it, that you have fascism. And you could define fascism in that kind of way. And a lot of theorists for whom the difference between a post-30 systems and a pre-30 system is very obvious and important will define the term in something like that way. At the same time, there's also a chunk of people who are currently in the United States using the concept of fascism to suggest that democracy is in danger in the United States, that liberal democracy is going to collapse and be replaced with an authoritarian system of government that's also racist. So they're thinking about it as authoritarianism plus racism. I think that argument is being used to clamp down on dissent of both left and right-wing varieties. And so I think it's politically not very tactical to use the term fascism right now, because it has become an important device in the fear narrative that is used to shrink the space for discourse in the United States. So what I tend to say is that there are kind of two different reasons that people don't like authoritarianism, standing apart from whatever their attitude is to capitalism. One is that they don't like tyranny. They don't like the idea of one particular person or one particular part of the system accumulating so much power that it can impose itself on the other parts. And a different worry is a concern about totalitarianism, a worry about an impersonal set of institutions that operate in a way that dominates all the particular individuals who try to interface or participate in those institutions, makes it so that no matter what they try, all forms of action lead back to the same place, because the impersonal incentives are too strong. They leave no space for any particular person to do anything. And they're both kinds of deep critiques of authoritarianism, but they're completely opposite to each other. And if you were to try to fix one, you would have to increase the risk of the other. So if you wanted to get rid of totalitarianism, you would need somebody strong and powerful who would be able to change the system of incentives without being bound by them. And if you wanted to get rid of tyranny, then you'd have to chain down the tyrant with a system of impersonal incentives that ties the tyrant's hands, makes it so the tyrant can't move. And in the United States today, there's an intense debate about whether we need to be worried about tyranny. Is Donald Trump going to become an authoritarian dictator, or someone like Donald Trump going to be an authoritarian dictator? Or do we have a totalitarian impersonal system in which there's a set of incentives that govern how you get up into the offices of the state that are so constraining that it's not possible to use the political system to accomplish anything? And those, I think, are two opposite critiques. And the use of fascism in the contemporary discourse is usually used to avoid dealing with this question of what precisely is wrong, in what way is the system at risk of becoming authoritarian. I think that the point that you're making about the general change in the 30s and in history is valid and interesting. Generally, the way I would tend to take it is that there are some of these kinds of modern states that emphasize more tyrannical features, a kind of strong leader. And then there are some of these modern states that emphasize totalitarian features, impersonal institutions that are meant to be dynamic and credible and to have certain kinds of advantages by their construction. What distinguishes what we call liberal democracies is that they favor totalitarianism rather than tyranny. And what distinguishes the states that we tend to refer to as fascist is that they tend to favor tyranny over totalitarianism. And the states that we call communist, like the Soviet Union and China, there's constantly debates in the West about which one is actually the one. With Xi Jinping, is he in charge or is the party a constraining totalitarian schema? We often seem unsure about this in the West. The same thing with the Soviet Union. There were constant debates over whether the particular Soviet leader was actually powerful or not in the Soviet system. It's a fascinating question with respect to those regimes. But I think in the contemporary discourse, that's where I tend to push it. Instead of talking about fascism, I talk about, are you worried about particular people or are you worried about impersonal structures? And don't you realize that by trying to counter the one, you may bring about the other? And I do that just to introduce complexity, because I do a lot of academic writing that's in this kind of, is democracy in trouble? Is democracy, liberal democracy, in a legitimation crisis? And so a lot of that literature is consumed with this worry about the tyrannical leader. And that worrying about a tyrant is often an excuse to create totalitarian systems. But conversely, worrying about totalitarian systems can be an excuse to create a tyrant, an excuse to create a Caesar figure or a Bonaparte or something like that. But if we break that down into kind of different types of authoritarianism, we can then oppose all of the different types as authoritarian in some way, while grappling with what makes them different. And I think with the term fascism, it's an emotional term that usually quiets down discussion about variation, and that makes it hard to, you need a very different political strategy if you were living in Nazi Germany and trying to oppose that state versus living in the United States and trying to oppose that state. You'd have to do different things. You'd have to interface with it differently. And I do want us to be able to talk about that variation and that difference in terms of how it works institutionally and structurally while still having a critique. And I think a lot of people will say, oh, there's fascism and then there's wonderful liberal democracy. That is not helpful, but at the same time, if we say it's all fascism, then we lose some of the specificity that we get when we start talking about exactly how does this authoritarianism work? Because it's not just the big orange man bad who just tells everybody what to do.
Yeah, so that framing is really nice too, because it counteracts the notion that tyranny equals authoritarianism, right? If you can say, oh no, actually totalitarianism can even take the form of a kind of liberal system or whatever, but it's about what the institutions are doing and who they promote. That is probably more effective than using fascism. All right, Ben, it's like the 2 hour and 15-minute mark now, so I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I again have enjoyed listening and reading a lot of things that you've done, and I am happy to have added another couple hours to the Ben Studebaker content on YouTube or wherever this will eventually reach people. And so if people want to find out, where you're writing and stuff like that, how would they find that information?
Yeah, so if you go to my blog, benjaminstudebaker.com, you can follow it via email. You can follow me on Twitter. You can even follow me on Facebook. I have a page. Anything I make, I blog about it. Anything I make, if it's writing. Not necessarily podcasts. I do a lot of podcasts. I don't alert people about every podcast. I will tweet out yours if there's a tweet. But anything I write, I blog it out. And so if you're on my list, you'll get everything I write. If it's behind a paywall, I generally try to help people get around it.
Cool. All right. Well, check that? I mean, what is it? Is it just benjaminstudebaker.com or?
Yep. BenjaminStudebaker.com. If you know my name, you know my website.
Perfect. All right. Well, I have been there. I'll tell you that. It's well worth taking a look at. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I have many other questions and whatnot too that I would be more than happy to pick your brain about. And so we'll have to do another 2-hour plus podcast again.
Yeah, I'd love to do another one. This was great. You ask wonderful questions.
Right on. Well, yeah, I have gotten the critique sometime of talking too much, and so I try to. But again, as I remember hearing Chomsky say sometime, concision is not necessarily my strong suit, which is why 2 hours. Those conversations tend to be better than the 30-second sound bites anyway. So whatever.
Well, you just tell people the timestamp for each of the questions, and they can find their way.
There you go. Fair enough. More work for me, but I'll do that for our lovely audience. So, all right, Ben. Well, I appreciate it, and take it easy and stay safe, and good luck to you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right, see you next time.